Hi, my name is Alex, and in this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I'm going to be sculpting a custom monster for the game Little Nightmares 2. So, to start off with, I didn't actually have much of a plan of what I was going to be doing with this guy. I just kind of wanted to sculpt whatever miniature came to mind at the time, and so I had an original plan to sculpt a character that had a kind of chain shirt underneath like a hooded coat of some sort. So I started by sculpting in the chain shirt once I added green stuff to the entire miniature by pushing little indents into the green stuff using my metal sculpting tool to create the illusion of chainmail. And I continue by adding more green stuff onto the legs and start sculpting in some kind of baggy pants. I quickly look up some reference just for clothing folds and that kind of thing to get an idea of what that actually looks like, and then proceed to sculpt those details in using primarily my metal like kind of oval sculpting tool. One thing I really wanted to add to this character was a cool mask, so kind of like a wooden mask with really simple holes in it for eyes. Because I just thought it would look kind of cool, and I guess my original thought was making something kind of druid-ish. Once I finish with the mask, I can leave that to dry and start working on the coat of this miniature. I decided that the front was going to be really open so that you could see all of the chainmail stuff that I had added, and what I'm focusing on as I'm sculpting the jacket is trying to sell the fold into what's going to be a belt, and making sure that it kind of reads properly as clothing that's kind of tucked into a belt that we're going to be sculpting later. And I think this is one of the details that made me think that this guy looked kind of like a character from Little Nightmares. And it was that I decided to give him some nice big chunky boots, which kind of messed a little bit with the proportions of the character more than I had anticipated. And I think it had something to do with the kind of clumsiness of that look of having really big boots that helped sell that kind of feel of the character. I then move on to actually add the mask onto the miniature itself, adding a little ball of green stuff onto the miniature to be the head that you're not actually going to see. And I think the wideness of the belt is another reason that it kind of looks like it belongs in Little Nightmares, because it's just a little bit oversized, which I find is a fairly consistent design choice that they use for all of the bigger characters in that game. I then give the character his hands, kind of designing them to be like kind of chunky gloves, before I move on to add the large hood over this character. And once I added the hood is when I actually decided I was going to make this a character for Little Nightmares, because the hood that I added was too big. Next time I would have made it a lot smaller, but after adding it, I just noticed that because of, again, the belt and the boots, and then now the hood, I was like, this actually reminds me a lot of some of the designs from Little Nightmares, and so I decided to really lean into that as I continued the build, but primarily later on as I painted the miniature. And having made that decision, once I had added the bow and the knife onto this miniature, I knew I also wanted to sculpt the two main characters from Little Nightmares 2 running along the base of this mini. And so I quickly bent up some wire and added that with some green stuff onto two tiny little pieces of wire. And these guys are so dang small. I absolutely love them. And then I start actually sculpting onto this armature that I made. Luckily, sculpting these miniatures this tiny wasn't as difficult as a lot of sculpting at this scale would be, because these characters' designs are based off of large shapes. And so they're actually really recognizable even at that tiny little scale. I mean, most of the time in the game, you're really small on the screen, and everything else is massive. Also, I honestly wouldn't recommend you do what I did to sculpt these guys, because I was running on a little bit of a time crunch to get this video out, even though I didn't release a video last week. Sorry about that. But I actually had to sculpt these guys without letting any of the green stuff set. Normally what I would have done is actually sculpted on the base shape, let it set, and then add the next layer, probably doing the heads completely separately, just so that the entire process would have been a lot easier, and I probably could have gotten a lot more detail into these miniatures if I had done that. But I was running on a bit of a time crunch for this video. But despite the time crunch, I was actually really happy with the amount of motion I was able to get into these two characters' poses. It really feels like the one character is being dragged along by the other. And like I mentioned before, you can kind of see with me playing around with putting on the second character's head, just how much I probably would have been a lot better to sculpt the head separately because of how much I had to move it back and forth and play with just the position of the head itself while also sculpting it into shape. So always do your sculpts in many layers and letting things set, because that way you have a lot more control over the details that you add. But now with this second character finished, I can move on to painting all the minis. So here you can see the first guy that I had sculpted, the monster, in this little mini diorama, I guess. And the first step to paint this guy was to cover the entire miniature in a dark purple. What I decided to do with this miniature was to keep with the kind of dark feeling of Little Nightmares. I painted everything a dark purple and used that as the shadow color for every single aspect of the miniature, working up highlights from that dark purple and mixing the purple into all the colors. And I found this to be a really cool way to create a dark feeling without just painting tons of black, which can make the miniature look kind of boring. There's still a little bit of interest even in the shadow color itself. I also make sure to add a little bit of black and white to all the colors that I paint with, because there's a really good job of just dulling them out. And as you can imagine, adding gray to a color essentially helps make the tone be a little bit more faded, which obviously for Little Nightmares is very important. Normally when I'm painting a miniature, I try to add another color for the highlight instead of adding just white, because when you add just white, you slowly are getting rid of the color and your miniature tends to look very desaturated. But obviously for this miniature, we want it to look incredibly desaturated, so adding the whites to the highlights isn't actually a big problem. I didn't actually have to choose many dynamic colors for this piece because, again, it's just supposed to be so dark and gritty, so the primary focus of the paint scheme is honestly the purple and just layers upon layers of browns, because as we move on to paint the other two main characters of the game, the one obviously wears this bright yellow rain jacket. And as those of you who took color theory would know, yellow is the complementary color of purple. So having the shadows for everything be purple and then the brightest color in this entire piece be yellow helps create strong contrast. And we're kind of playing within just the color scheme of yellow to purple, which is yellows and then browns and purples. So the piece is very, very nice from a theoretical standpoint. We've appeased the color theory gods, I guess. But having one character be yellow and everything else just be shades of purple and browns really helps make that character stand out, which is going to be really cool, especially with how tiny this character is in the grand scope of the entire diorama. As I'm painting these two smaller characters, some of the things that I'm focusing on is firstly keeping the light source consistent with where the other character is going to be and how I've painted him, but also I'm kind of trying to add a little bit more depth and dynamics than the sculpt actually allows. You can see on the hood I'm kind of creating pockets of shadow and then more highlights than are necessarily visible on the actual sculpt itself to help make sure these characters look nice and dynamic beyond just how well I've been able to sculpt them at such a tiny little scale. And because the miniatures are so small, your eye really can't distinguish between what's a sculpted detail and what's a painted detail. But once I add the final touches of brown onto the one character's coat, I can add a base, and the miniature project diorama, I guess at this point, is finished. I really enjoyed this project. When I started off, I kind of wanted to just kind of sculpt whatever miniature I had on my mind at the time, but I think it was really cool how it kind of turned into this original character monster diorama for Little Nightmares 2. I was kind of feeling uninspired most of the way through the project until I kind of came up with that idea. I especially like the painting using the complementary colors and a very purple scheme for all the shadows. It kind of helped add a good bit of interest to the piece while keeping it fairly dull and in theme with Little Nightmares 2. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's a little bit of a different theme than I normally do. If you guys like the idea of doing more content based off of video game characters or the like, leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe and hit the bell. All that stuff is really helpful for a growing channel. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, do all that stuff. It's super helpful for a growing channel. But nonetheless, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.